Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the strange and powerful idea of technocratic control, the belief that experts, scientists, and engineers can manage society like a machine. Sounds efficient, right? But what if behind the promise of precision lies something more dangerous, a loss of freedom, of individuality, and maybe even of our very humanity? So what exactly is technocracy? At its core, technocracy is the rule of experts. It's the idea that those with technical or scientific knowledge should be the ones making decisions for society, not politicians, not the public, not representatives elected by you and me. The argument is that experts are rational, efficient, and best equipped to make decisions about economics, infrastructure, energy, healthcare, you name it. Why let messy democracy slow things down when you can optimize everything with a good algorithm? Now that might sound modern, even futuristic, but it's not new. This idea actually emerged over a century ago, during the early 1900s, when progressives and positivist thinkers like Thorstein Veblen and Howard Scott began dreaming of a world scientifically managed from the top down. They believed human behavior, institutions, even morals could be optimized, engineered like a factory. Technocratic thinkers saw society as a machine, a system of moving parts, inputs and outputs, that could be fine-tuned, monitored, and perfected. To them, democracy was often seen as inefficient, emotional, and outdated. Why rely on public opinion when you could rely on data? But this raises the big question we'll explore throughout this video, a question that cuts to the heart of history, power, and the human experience. Can society be centrally engineered without sacrificing freedom, distorting incentives, or ignoring complexity? That's what we're here to unpack. We'll look at historical case studies, from the Soviet Union to the European Union, from post-war institutions to modern digital technocracies, to understand what happens when a few experts try to redesign the lives of millions. So buckle in. This isn't just a story about the past, it's a story about how power is justified, how systems rise and fall, and what happens when control becomes more important than consent. Let's begin our journey with the Soviet Union, the first real attempt in history to engineer an entire society through central planning and expert control. This wasn't just a political revolution. It was a technocratic experiment on a massive scale. The Bolsheviks didn't just want to change who was in charge, they wanted to scientifically reshape how society functioned from the ground up. At the heart of this experiment was something called scientific socialism. This concept fused Marxist ideology with a belief that progress could be designed, measured, and executed through the tools of science. If you just had enough data, enough planning, and enough control, you could eliminate chaos, inequality, and even human suffering. That was the promise. But behind the vision stood a powerful central apparatus, Gosplan, the State Planning Committee. Gosplan was responsible for directing nearly every aspect of economic life in the Soviet Union. Instead of supply and demand, decisions were made by bureaucrats setting production quotas, 5-year plans, and resource allocations, all from the top down. At first, it all looked incredibly ambitious. Electrification campaigns, massive steel production targets, heroic visions of industrial cities rising from the plains. The propaganda was everywhere. A future of order and abundance seemed just around the corner. But reality had other plans. The optimism quickly collided with brutal realities. Central planners, no matter how educated, couldn't account for the complexity of millions of decisions made every day by farmers, workers, and consumers. Shortages emerged, quality collapsed, and worst of all, human suffering skyrocketed. The most haunting example, the Holodomor, a man-made famine in Ukraine that killed millions, driven by unrealistic quotas and the forced seizure of grain. It was not a failure of effort, it was a failure of planning. Why did this happen? Because central planning suppressed local knowledge. It couldn't respond to changing conditions or individual needs. It replaced human signals, like prices and preferences, with rigid instructions from bureaucrats far removed from the consequences of their own decisions. And without those feedback loops, incentives were distorted. Factories would meet quotas by producing unusable goods, like nails that were the wrong size or boots that nobody wanted, just to check off a box. This is what economists call the calculation problem, and the Soviet Union made it painfully real. So while the Soviet technocracy promised order, what it produced was fragility. What began as a scientific dream ended in economic dysfunction, political repression, and human tragedy. And yet, this was only the beginning. After the collapse of fascism and the horrors of World War II, the West took a very different path than the Soviet Union, but it didn't abandon technocratic ideals. It just softened them, wrapped them in institutions, and exported them globally. Instead of 5-year plans and forced quotas, Western technocracy took the form of policy conferences, economic modeling, and international financial governance. This is where we see the rise of institutional technocracy, a system where institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank became the engines of post-war economic order. Under the Bretton Woods system, these institutions were tasked with stabilizing currencies, rebuilding economies, and guiding global development. But in doing so, they became powerful tools for expert-driven control, often with little direct accountability to the populations affected. At the same time, Western governments embraced economic management as a science. Influenced by Keynesian economics and systems theory, policymakers began to believe they could fine-tune economies like thermostats. If unemployment rose, just stimulate demand. If inflation ticked up, tighten policy. It all sounded logical, rational, even scientific. But here's the catch: as these economic tools expanded, so did the distance between decision-makers and the public. Managerial elites, unelected experts and bureaucrats gained enormous influence in shaping policy. Their authority wasn't based on votes or representation, but on technical credentials and access to institutions. Over time, this created a class of decision-makers who weren't accountable in the traditional democratic sense, and yet they held the levers of monetary, fiscal, and even social policy. And what were the long-term effects? Well, let's take a key turning point, the year 1971, when the United States officially ended the gold standard. That single policy decision, driven by elite advisors and economic models, changed everything. It untethered money from a fixed value, opening the door to inflation, asset bubbles, debt spirals, and unprecedented financial complexity. It was a move designed to give governments more flexibility, but it also introduced greater risk and volatility. Some would argue we're still living in the shadow of that choice today. So while post-war technocracy may have looked more stable than the Soviet model, it carried its own hidden dangers: creeping centralization, eroded democratic input, and a growing disconnect between economic policy and everyday life. This wasn't totalitarianism. It was something more subtle, a velvet-gloved form of control, but control nonetheless. Now let's look at a modern case study in supranational technocracy, the European Union, a political and economic union made up of over 24 member states, many with wildly different cultures, languages, and economic conditions. And yet, much of its governance flows not from national capitals, but from Brussels. At the center of this technocratic structure are institutions like the European Commission and the European Central Bank, powerful, unelected bodies that wield enormous influence over policy. These aren't just coordinating agencies. They make decisions on behalf of hundreds of millions of people across Europe, often without any direct democratic mandate. This creates a unique dynamic. National governments are still technically in charge, but in practice, they often must follow the rules set by centralized EU institutions. That's what we mean by top-down policy enforcement. Whether it's agricultural standards, environmental targets, or monetary policy, decisions are applied uniformly, even if they clash with the unique needs or values of individual member states. Nowhere was this tension more visible than during the Greek debt crisis. After the 2008 financial collapse, Greece found itself buried in debt. But instead of being allowed to devalue its currency or manage its own recovery, Greece was bound to the euro, a currency it didn't control. In came the Troika, the European Commission, the ECB, and the IMF, demanding harsh austerity in exchange for bailouts. And here's where things get really interesting: the Greek people voted against these austerity measures in a national referendum. But the policies went through anyway. The will of the people was overridden by the will of the technocrats. The result? Massive protests, social unrest, and a deep sense of democratic betrayal. This exposed a fundamental structural flaw in the EU's design. The Eurozone created a monetary union, shared currency, shared interest rates, but without full fiscal integration. That means countries like Germany and Greece use the same money, but have wildly different economies and no shared tax or spending system to absorb shocks. It's like trying to steer a bus where everyone controls a different wheel. This structure creates what economists call moral hazard, where some countries bear the costs of others' decisions, and rigidity, where nations can't respond flexibly to local problems. It's a system designed for uniformity, not complexity. So what we see in the EU is a new kind of technocracy, not just national planning, but transnational control, a web of experts and institutions operating above the level of the voter, with enormous power, and very little pushback. And the question is, how sustainable is that? Now we arrive at perhaps the most controversial face of modern technocracy, the World Economic Forum. You've probably heard the slogan, "You'll own nothing, and you'll be happy." It's the kind of phrase that sounds like satire, until you realize it reflects a real vision being promoted by some of the most powerful figures on the planet. Founded by Klaus Schwab in the 1970s, the WEF started as a small gathering of European business leaders. Today, it's a global hub of corporate executives, government officials, central bankers, and thought leaders, all converging in Davos each year to discuss the future of the world. Sounds harmless, even constructive, until you realize how much influence these unelected actors wield over global policy. The WEF doesn't make laws, but through what it calls public-private partnerships, it shapes the frameworks that laws are built on. It encourages governments and corporations to align their strategies, especially around topics like climate change, social governance, and digital transformation. On paper, this sounds noble, but in practice, it consolidates decision-making into the hands of a very small, very elite group. Enter the Great Reset, a sweeping proposal introduced during the COVID-19 pandemic to rebuild the world differently. The idea was to use the crisis as a launchpad to rethink capitalism, restructure economies, and accelerate digitalization. Again, the language was optimistic, but the implications were massive. This was not reform. This was redesign. One of the tools promoted under this vision is the ESG framework, environmental, social, and governance scores that rate companies based not on their profitability, but on how well they align with certain social and environmental goals. Critics argue this amounts to a form of corporate social engineering, a way to reward ideological compliance and punish dissent, not through laws, but through access to capital. And then there's the push for digital identity systems, often framed as tools for convenience, security, or health tracking. But these systems also raise questions about surveillance, data ownership, and what happens when your access to services is tied to a centralized digital profile. What starts as efficiency can quickly turn into control. So why does this matter? Because the WEF is not just a think tank. It's a worldview, a technocratic vision where a handful of global elites, in business suits, not military uniforms, guide the direction of entire societies without ever standing for election. And the most dangerous part? It doesn't feel like tyranny. It feels like progress. Now that we've explored technocracy in its many forms, from Soviet planners to European regulators to global forums, let's step back and ask, what are the patterns? What do these systems, separated by geography and ideology, all have in common? Because once you start noticing the recurring themes, it becomes impossible to unsee them. The first is top-down control. In every version of technocracy, power flows from the center, not from the bottom up. Whether it's a central committee, a supranational institution, or a corporate boardroom, decisions are made by a select few and imposed on the many. The assumption is always the same: experts know best. But expertise doesn't always equal wisdom, and centralized decisions often come with blind spots. That leads us to the next pattern: incentive misalignment. You see, when decisions are made far from the people they affect, the feedback loop breaks. Planners aren't exposed to the consequences of their own mistakes. A bureaucrat in Brussels doesn't suffer when Greek youth unemployment hits 50%. A central banker doesn't lose sleep when inflation eats away at retiree savings. Without skin in the game, incentives warp, and so do outcomes. Another key pattern is what we might call cognitive overreach. Technocratic systems are built on models, metrics, and data, and that sounds great. But human society isn't a lab experiment. It's messy, emotional, unpredictable. No algorithm can account for the full complexity of human behavior, cultural differences, or local knowledge. And yet, planners often behave as if they can see the whole picture. They can't. This overconfidence leads to what economists call unintended consequences. Policies meant to reduce inequality sometimes concentrate wealth. Energy regulations designed to save the planet sometimes result in shortages and blackouts. Public health campaigns with the best intentions sometimes erode trust and freedom. Technocracies promise predictability, but they often deliver surprises. And then there's the creeping problem of compliance culture. Because technocratic systems rely on coordination, not competition, they often require everyone to align. That means standardizing behavior, suppressing dissent, and discouraging innovation that doesn't fit the model. Whether it's economic policy or social values, the system starts to favor sameness over spontaneity. The result? Less resilience, less adaptability, and eventually, less freedom. So while technocracy might seem like a modern solution to complex problems, history shows it often repeats the same mistakes, just in more sophisticated packaging. And if we don't recognize these patterns, we're bound to live them again. So if technocracy has all these problems, top-down rigidity, distorted incentives, blind spots, what's the alternative? It's not chaos. It's not anarchy. It's something much older, much more organic, and much more powerful. It's decentralization. Now that word gets thrown around a lot, but let's break down what it really means. At its heart, decentralization is the idea that decision-making should be distributed, that no single authority has a monopoly on wisdom, and that individuals and communities closest to the problems are often the best equipped to solve them. Think about how markets work, not markets in the Wall Street sense, but in the basic sense, as systems of voluntary exchange. Each person, each business, each household is making constant decisions based on their own needs, preferences, and circumstances. No one plans it, no one controls it, and yet, something remarkable happens. Order emerges. This is what economists call spontaneous order. It's not designed from above. It bubbles up from below. It's why farmers in different climates grow different crops. It's why towns develop unique industries. It's why innovation often comes not from committees, but from individuals tinkering in garages, labs, or even online forums. Decentralized systems harness local knowledge, the stuff no central planner can ever fully understand. But it's not just about economics. It's also about morality. When people are free to make choices and bear the consequences of those choices, something changes. Responsibility becomes real, trust becomes essential, and relationships, whether economic or social, are built on mutual consent, not coercion. That's the moral power of decentralization. It respects agency. It treats people not as inputs in a machine, but as human beings, capable of thinking, adapting, and learning. And there's historical evidence to back this up. After the fall of the Soviet Union, many former communist countries struggled to rebuild. But those that embraced decentralization, competitive markets, private property, and open information bounced back faster. They didn't wait for perfect plans. They let people figure things out. And it worked. Now, decentralization isn't perfect. It can be messy, unequal, unpredictable, but it has one advantage technocracy never will. It learns. Because when individuals and communities make mistakes, they adjust. When centralized systems make mistakes, they double down. So in a world increasingly tempted by expert rule, digital IDs, and global standards, the case for decentralization is not nostalgia, it's necessity. It's how we preserve freedom, foster innovation, and protect human dignity in the face of systems that would reduce us to data points. So here we are, at the end of a journey through blueprints, bureaus, and boardrooms. From Soviet grain quotas to digital ID programs, from the idealism of scientific planners to the cold efficiency of global finance, one question keeps echoing. Can society be engineered without losing its soul? Technocracy promises order, efficiency, progress. It wraps itself in the language of reason and the authority of science. And to be fair, some of those tools can be useful. Expertise matters. Data can help. Systems can scale. But history whispers a warning. When power concentrates in the hands of a few, no matter how credentialed or well-intentioned, the risks don't go away. They just get harder to see. A spreadsheet can be just as dangerous as a sword if it severs people from the consequences of their decisions. The dream of controlling society like a machine might sound elegant, but people aren't machines. We're messy, emotional, creative, contradictory, and thank God for that, because it's in that unpredictability, in that chaos, that life actually happens. Markets adapt, communities evolve, cultures renew themselves, not through central plans, but through countless acts of individual choice and collective wisdom. That's not just more humane, it's more resilient. So here's the takeaway. Be cautious of those who claim to have the master plan, especially when they don't need your consent to implement it. Because history shows us something simple and profound. The more control they have, the less soul remains. If you found this video thought-provoking, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. We explore the forgotten truths and deeper patterns behind history every week. And if you want to go even deeper, check out my book History They Tried to Erase. The link is in the description. It's filled with stories, lessons, and warnings from the past that most textbooks leave out. Thanks for watching. And remember, history isn't just about what happened. It's about who got to tell the story and what they left out.